All right, so we're diving into uh, what keeps people from voting.
Okay.
And to really dig into this, you sent over Democracy in Action, Episode 4, Barriers to Voter Engagement.
Right.
I mean, we all probably know someone who could vote but doesn't.
Yeah.
So we're going to get all these different kinds of obstacles, legal, structural, all of it.
You know what I thought was really interesting is how the podcast host Alex Thompson starts the episode.
Yeah.
He really gets at that why question. He's not saying that people just don't care. It's
Right.
like there are these actual barriers preventing them. And he and his guest, Laura Mitchell, she's a legal expert,
Okay.
they break all these barriers down into categories so it's easier to understand.
That makes sense.
It can be really overwhelming otherwise.
Oh, yeah, definitely. And speaking of overwhelming, they jump right into legal and structural barriers
Yeah.
with a really tangible example, voter ID laws.
Mm-hmm.
And, at first it seems simple enough, but then you realize needing a specific ID can actually prevent certain groups from voting.
Yeah.
Like older people, people struggling financially, minorities.
Yeah.
They're less likely to have a driver's license or passport. And, getting another kind of ID can be a real challenge.
And Laura Mitchell brought up a point that really stuck with me.
Yeah.
She said, for someone who doesn't drive, getting a government-issued ID can be incredibly hard.
I can see that.
I mean, think about it. The cost, the time it takes to travel there, the documents you might need.
Right.
She even pointed out that sometimes people might not even have a birth certificate.
Wow.
It's a powerful example of how something that seems small
Yeah.
can actually be a huge obstacle to voting.
Absolutely. And the podcast also talks about how complicated voter registration can be and how that discourages people. I mean, who hasn't felt lost trying to deal with all that paperwork?
Yeah.
Tight deadlines, information that's not clear. It's easy to see how people get frustrated, especially if they've already got a lot going on.
Yeah, definitely.
And then there's gerrymandering, which honestly sounds like something from a movie.
Right. It's a little more complex than just redrawing lines on a map, though.
Okay.
Basically, it's manipulating those district boundaries. So one party has an unfair advantage. The podcast uses this great analogy. Imagine, cramming all your opponents into just a few districts.
Oh, I see.
So their votes are all concentrated in one place, while your supporters are spread out across many districts to get the most wins.
That's kind of sneaky.
Yeah. And it leads to safe seats where you already know who's going to win.
So people feel like their vote doesn't matter.
Exactly. And that leads to lower voter turnout. Because why bother if you think your vote won't change anything?
It's almost like the system creates the apathy and then uses that to justify itself.
Yeah, exactly.
And the Democracy in Action team doesn't stop there. They go beyond just politics, and they look at how people's social and economic situations affect whether they vote.
Right.
They had this sociologist, Dr. Kevin Liu, who said something fascinating about how economic instability can overshadow voting. Like, when people are focused on basic survival, it's hard to think about politics.
And that's something we can all relate to, prioritizing needs. If you're struggling to put food on the table or keep a roof over your head,
Right.
worrying about who to vote for just seems like an extra thing you can't deal with.
Makes sense.
Dr. Liu argues that people in survival mode often push aside political engagement. It's like that hierarchy of needs, basic needs come first before you can worry about anything else.
It's a good point, and it makes you wonder how many people don't vote just because they're too busy trying to get by.
Right.
Right. And then the podcast also talked about how education levels can affect voter turnout.
Yeah, and it's not about being judgmental.
Yeah.
It's more about how feeling informed and understanding the political process can make you feel more empowered to vote. Think about it if you don't get how the system works.
Yeah.
Or if you feel like your vote doesn't really count.
Right.
Are you going to go through all that effort to cast a ballot?
Probably not. And that takes us to another layer that the podcast explored, psychological and cultural barriers.
Yeah.
Things like apathy, not trusting the system, feeling like voting doesn't actually change anything.
Right.
Those are some heavy things to deal with.
It really gets at what we believe about the world.
Right.
Like, if you really think your vote won't make a difference, why bother putting in the effort? It's like that saying, if voting changed anything, they'd make it illegal.
Right.
It's obviously an exaggeration, but it reflects how powerless a lot of people feel.
Yeah.
And that feeling impacts whether they participate.
For sure. And to really drive this point home, the podcast brought in Maya Hernandez, a community organizer.
Oh, yeah.
And she shared this perspective that really resonated with me. She said that many people feel disconnected from politicians
Okay.
because they just don't seem to represent their interests or experiences.
Yeah, I think Maya really hit the mark when she talked about how that lack of representation leads to apathy. If you don't see yourself reflected in the people who are making decisions that affect your life,
Right.
why would you care about the process?
It's like being asked to play a game where the rules are rigged against you.
Exactly.
And Maya added that this feeling of alienation is often made worse by certain narratives, especially in marginalized communities.
It's interesting how these narratives can become so deeply rooted.
Right.
Like if you grow up hearing voting doesn't matter or all politicians are corrupt, it's going to shape your view of the system.
Yeah, it will.
And Maya pointed out that these narratives often come from historical experiences of being excluded and oppressed,
Right.
which makes them even stronger and harder to change.
It's like a cycle of disengagement that feeds on itself.
Yeah.
Really hard to break free.
Yeah.
So we've uncovered a lot here, from the very real hurdles like voter ID laws to the more intangible stuff like apathy and distrust.
Absolutely. And the important thing is that democracy in action doesn't just point out the problems.
Okay.
It also starts to hint at solutions.
Yeah.
It's not about blaming people for not voting.
Oh.
It's about understanding all the complex reasons why voter turnout is low.
Okay.
And once we understand those reasons, we can start to think about how to address them.
Yeah, I'm really curious to hear about those potential solutions the podcast discussed. But first, let's just pause for a minute and let all of this sink in.
Yeah.
What are your initial thoughts so far? Anything that surprised you or maybe connected with your own experiences?
You know, as we were talking about all these different barriers,
Yeah.
it really struck me how connected they all are.
Yeah.
It's not just one thing preventing someone from voting.
Right.
It's often a bunch of factors combined.
Hmm.
Imagine someone struggling financially who also faces language barriers and can't find clear information about voting.
Yeah.
They're getting hit from every direction,
Oh, definitely.
making it even tougher to participate.
Yeah, it's like trying to climb a mountain while carrying a heavy backpack.
Exactly. And the Democracy in Action team actually dug into some potential ways to lighten that load.
Okay, good. Because it feels pretty heavy right now.
They did, and they started with something that seems pretty basic but could make a big difference: simplifying voter registration.
Okay.
Alex Thompson, the host, argued that making registration automatic,
Wow.
or at least letting people register on the same day they vote,
Mm-hmm.
could eliminate a major obstacle for a lot of people.
Makes sense.
Hmm.
What about the whole voter ID debate, though?
Oh, yeah.
That seemed pretty controversial on the podcast.
It is, and there are strong arguments on both sides.
Right.
But what I appreciated is that the podcast didn't just present the two extremes.
Yeah.
They looked for some middle ground,
Yeah.
talking about the need for ID requirements that are more flexible.
Okay, how would that work?
Well, like allowing a wider variety of documents
Mm.
or having other ways to verify someone's identity.
Right.
That could be a way to balance security with making voting accessible.
So we've talked about easier registration, more flexible ID requirements.
Yeah.
But what about the deeper issues like economic struggles and lack of education?
Yeah,
Those seem a lot harder to fix.
they are, but the podcast didn't shy away from them.
Okay, good.
They talked about how important it is to address economic inequality
Mm-hmm.
through policies that support job security, affordable housing, and access to quality education.
So basically creating a more stable foundation for people.
Exactly. The idea is that if people's basic needs are met,
Yeah.
they'll have more time, energy, and mental space to get involved in politics.
That makes sense. And I remember Dr. Liu talking about the challenges people face trying to balance work with voting.
Right.
Did the podcast have any solutions for that?
They did, and some of them were pretty bold, like making Election Day a national holiday.
Wow.
Can you imagine? It would send a strong message about how important civic engagement is.
It would.
They also discussed having early voting periods
Mhm.
and making mail-in ballots easier to get so people have more options to vote without having to miss work or other commitments.
Yeah, those are all really good ideas. But what about the psychological and cultural barriers we talked about?
Right.
How do we address things like apathy and distrust and those deep-seated beliefs that keep people from feeling empowered to vote?
Well, the podcast highlighted the importance of civic education, especially for young people.
Yeah.
The idea is that if you understand how the system works and how your vote fits into the big picture, you're more likely to value it and fight for it.
That makes sense. But what about people who are already disillusioned with the system?
That's where open dialogue and community engagement become really important.
Okay.
The podcast had some inspiring examples of grassroots initiatives that are working to rebuild trust from the ground up.
Like what?
Think voter education workshops, voter registration drives,
Yeah.
and platforms where people can have open conversations about the issues that matter most to them.
I remember Maya Hernandez talking about how powerful community organizing can be for empowering marginalized communities.
Exactly, when people feel like their voices are being heard and that they have a real say in what happens.
Right.
They're more likely to get involved.
For sure.
And that's something community-led initiatives are great at.
Uh-huh.
They create this sense of ownership over the democratic process,
Right.
which is so important for overcoming apathy and cynicism.
It's inspiring to see how all these solutions can work together
Yeah.
to create a more participatory democracy.
Yeah.
It's not about finding one perfect solution. It's
Right.
about using a bunch of different approaches to tackle the problem from all angles.
Absolutely. And what I find really encouraging is that the Democracy in Action podcast doesn't just leave us with a list of things that need fixing.
Mm-hmm.
It paints this vision of a future where everyone's voice is heard,
Wow.
where policies actually reflect what people want,
Right.
and where that ideal of one person, one vote becomes a reality.
That's a powerful vision, and it makes me wonder, what would a world with full voter participation really look like?
It is a question worth thinking about.
Right.
Would we see political priorities change?
Would policies be more responsive to the needs of everyday people?
Oh, it would be amazing.
Would we feel a greater sense of shared responsibility for the direction of society?
It's fascinating to think about all the potential ripple effects.
It really is, and it makes you realize that this conversation about voter engagement isn't just about numbers.
Yeah, it's bigger than that.
It's about the core of our society
Yeah.
and the kind of future we want to create.
Absolutely. And as we move into the final part of our deep dive, I'm curious to explore what this vision of full voter participation could mean for each of us.
Okay.
What role can we play in making it a reality? And what are some potential pitfalls to watch out for as we navigate this complex issue?
Great questions.
Yeah, this has been a really eye-opening journey with you through the Democracy in Action podcast.
It has.
It's made me realize that voter engagement is about so much more than just casting a ballot.
Right.
It's about the health of our democracy,
Yeah.
the power of collective action, and ultimately shaping the kind of society we want to live in. I agree, and what I find so compelling about this episode is that it doesn't just present a doom and gloom picture.
Okay.
It acknowledges the challenges, but it also offers hope and possibility.
That's important.
Yeah, it's crucial because it gives us the power to move past feeling overwhelmed
Right.
and start thinking about what we can do to make a difference.
Exactly. Like, okay, we've identified the barriers.
Right.
We've looked at some potential solutions. Now what?
Yeah.
What can we as individuals do to contribute to this vision of everyone voting?
Well, I think the first step is recognizing that we're not powerless.
Okay.
Even small actions can make a difference.
I like that.
We can start by learning about the issues ourselves,
Mm-hmm.
having real conversations with our friends and family,
Yeah.
and advocating for policies that make it easier for people to vote.
Right. It's like that saying, be the change you want to see in the world.
Exactly.
But it's not just about individual actions, is it? There's also a need for collective effort.
Absolutely. The podcast really highlighted the power of grassroots movements and community organizing.
Yeah.
When people come together with a shared goal, they can make their voices louder and create real change.
Right.
Think about the civil rights movement, the women's suffrage movement, even the recent push for climate action.
Yeah.
All these movements were driven by collective action.
They were.
And they show how powerful it can be when people work together to demand change.
That's so inspiring.
Yeah.
But as we're working towards getting everyone to vote, are there any potential problems we should watch out for?
That's a great question, and I think the podcast touched on this indirectly.
Okay.
It's important to approach this with humility
Yeah.
and recognize that there's no one-size-fits-all solution.
Right.
What works in one community might not work in another. And we have to listen to and learn from the experiences of the people who are most affected by being kept from voting.
So it's not just about pushing our own ideas. It's about working with communities to create solutions that fit their specific needs and challenges.
Exactly. And we also need to be aware of unintended consequences.
Like what?
Well, for example, simplifying voter registration is a good goal,
Yeah.
but we need to make sure that any changes don't accidentally create new problems,
Like what kinds of problems?
like making it easier for fraud to happen.
Oh, I see.
It's about finding that balance between accessibility and security
Right.
and recognizing that any solution will probably have both good and bad sides.
Makes sense. And I think The podcast also subtly warned against complacency.
Uh-huh.
Reaching full voter participation isn't a one-time thing.
No, it's not.
It's an ongoing process.
Yeah, it's not about reaching a finish line.
Right.
It's more like setting out on a journey of continuous improvement and adaptation.
I like that. And as we move forward on this journey,
Yes.
the Democracy in Action podcast has given us some great tools and insights to guide us. It reminded us how important it is to understand the complexities, explore potential solutions, and take action both as individuals and together.
I agree.
And I think the podcast ended on a really thought-provoking note.
Yeah.
They asked listeners to imagine a world where everyone who's eligible to vote actually does.
It's a simple question, but with huge implications.
Is what would change? How would our society be different?
It makes us dream big.
Yeah.
To imagine a future where the power of democracy is truly unleashed.
Right. And even though that future might seem far off,
Yeah,
the journey starts with each of us.
absolutely.
It starts with recognizing how powerful our own voices are,
Right.
getting involved in our communities and working together to create a world where every vote counts.
Well said.
This deep dive into what prevents people from voting has been truly enlightening.
It has.
We've explored the complexities, we've uncovered potential solutions, and hopefully sparked some inspiration for action. And remember, as Democracy in Action reminded us so eloquently, the power to shape our democracy is in each and every one of us.
Absolutely.
Thanks for joining us on this incredible journey.
As we were talking about all these barriers,
Right?
it really hit me how interconnected they are.
Yeah.
Like, it's not just one thing keeping someone from voting.
Right?
It's often a whole bunch of factors all tangled up.
Right. Like that example we talked about.
Exactly.
Someone's struggling financially, facing language barriers, and not having clear info about voting.
They're getting hit from every angle.
Right. It makes it so much harder to participate.
Yeah, and the Democracy in Action team actually looked at some ways to address that.
Okay, good. I was wondering about that.
Yeah, they did. And they started with something that seems pretty straightforward, simplifying voter registration.
Okay.
Alex Thompson, the host, suggested making registration automatic,
Oh, wow.
or at least allowing same-day registration.
Right.
He argued that could be a huge help for a lot of people.
That makes sense. But what about that whole voter ID debate? Yeah. That seems like a really tricky issue in the podcast.
It is a tough one, and there are valid points on both sides.
Right.
But what I found interesting is that they didn't just present the two extremes.
Okay.
They actually explored some middle ground,
Uh-huh.
emphasizing the need for more flexible ID requirements.
Okay. What would that look like?
Well, they talked about things like allowing a wider range of documents.
That's right.
Or offering alternative ways to verify someone's identity.
So it's about finding a compromise.
Yeah, exactly. Finding a balance between security and accessibility.
So we've got easier registration, more flexible IDs. What about those deeper issues like economic struggles and lack of education?
Right. Those are tougher nuts to crack.
Yeah, they feel really big.
But the podcast didn't shy away from them.
Okay, good.
They talked about the importance of addressing economic inequality,
Uh-huh.
things like policies that promote job security, affordable housing access to quality education.
It's like building a stronger base for people.
Exactly, if people's basic needs are met, they're more likely to have the time, energy, and mental space to engage in the political process.
It makes sense. And I remember Dr. Liu talking about how hard it is for people to balance work with voting.
Yeah, it can be a real juggling act.
Did they offer any solutions for that in the podcast?
They did, and some were pretty radical, like making Election Day a national holiday.
Wow, that would be amazing.
Right. It would really send a strong message about how much we value civic engagement.
For sure. They also talked about early voting periods.
Yes.
Yeah.
And expanding access to mail-in ballots, giving people more flexibility to vote without disrupting their work or other commitments.
Those are all great ideas.
Yeah.
What about those psychological and cultural barriers we discussed, though? How do we tackle those? The apathy, the distrust.
Yeah, and those ingrained narratives that prevent people from feeling like their vote matters.
Exactly.
Well, the podcast stressed the importance of civic education,
Okay.
especially for young people.
Right. Starting early.
The thinking is, if you understand how the system works and you see how your vote fits into the bigger picture, you're more likely to see it as valuable and something we're fighting for.
Okay, I get that. But what about people who are already disillusioned?
That's a good point. And that's where open dialogue and community engagement come in.
Okay.
They highlighted some inspiring examples of grassroots initiatives that are rebuilding trust from the ground up.
Cool. Can you give me some examples?
Sure, things like voter education workshops, registration drives, and creating platforms where people can have open and honest conversations about the issues that matter most to them.
I remember Maya Hernandez talking about how powerful community organizing can be,
Yeah,
especially for empowering those who have been marginalized.
exactly, when people feel like their voices are being heard
Right.
and like they have a real stake in the outcomes,
Yeah,
they're more likely to participate.
definitely. And these community-led efforts are great at that.
They foster a sense of ownership over the democratic process,
Right.
and that's so important for overcoming apathy and cynicism.
It's pretty amazing to see how all these different solutions can work together
Yeah.
to create a more participatory democracy.
It's not about finding that one magic bullet.
Right.
It's about using a variety of approaches to tackle the problem from every angle.
And what I find really encouraging
Yeah.
is that the podcast doesn't just leave us with a to-do list.
Uh-huh.
It actually paints a picture of a future where everyone's voice matters.
I love that part.
Me too. Where policies reflect what people actually want,
Yeah.
and where that ideal of one person, one vote becomes a reality. It's a powerful vision, and it makes me wonder, what would a world with full voter participation actually look like?
Right. Like, what would actually change?
Yeah. Would we see a shift in political priorities?
It's fascinating to think about.
Would policies be more responsive to the needs of everyday people?
Maybe we'd feel a greater sense of shared responsibility.
It really makes you realize that this conversation about voter engagement is about so much more than just numbers.
It is. It's about the very fabric of our society.
Right. And the kind of future we want to build.
Exactly. And as we move to the final part of our deep dive,
Yeah.
I'm excited to explore what this vision of full participation could mean for each of us.
Me too.
Yeah.
What role can we play in making it happen? And what are some of those potential pitfalls we need to be mindful of as we move forward?
It's been amazing going through this Democracy in Action podcast with you.
It really has.
I'm realizing that voter engagement is so much bigger than just voting.
Yeah.
It's about how healthy our democracy is, the power we have when we act together, and shaping the kind of society we want to live in.
You know what I really like about this episode?
What's that?
Is that it doesn't just focus on all the bad stuff.
Yeah.
It shows us the problems,
Yeah.
but it also offers hope and a sense of what's possible.
Right. That's so important.
Yeah, it gives us the power to move past feeling overwhelmed and start thinking about what we can actually do.
Exactly. We've seen the barriers. We've looked at potential solutions.
Now what? What can we do as individuals to help make this vision of full voter participation a reality?
Well, first off, we need to remember that we're not powerless.
Right.
Even small actions can have a ripple effect.
Like what?
We can start by educating ourselves about the issues,
Mhm.
having real conversations with our friends and family,
Yeah.
and speaking up for policies that make voting easier for everyone.
I like that. It's like that saying, be the change you want to see in the world.
Exactly. But it's not just about what we do on our own right. We need collective action, too.
Right, like working together.
Absolutely. The podcast really highlighted how powerful grassroots movements and community organizing can be.
Yeah, those can make a real difference.
When people unite around a common goal,
Yeah.
their voices become amplified and they can drive real change.
Like those historical examples you mentioned.
Exactly. The civil rights movement, the women's suffrage movement,
Right. Huge movement.
even the recent push for climate action, all fueled by people coming together to demand change.
That's so inspiring. But are there any things we should watch out for as we work towards getting everyone to vote?
That's a great question. And I think the podcast touched on this subtly.
Okay.
We need to approach this with humility,
Mm-hmm.
recognizing that there's no one-size-fits-all solution.
Right. Different communities, different needs.
Exactly. What works in one place might not work in another.
True.
And we have to listen to and learn from the people who are most impacted by being kept from voting.
So it's about collaboration, not just pushing our own agenda.
Right. It's about working together to find solutions that fit each community's unique challenges.
And we also have to be careful about unintended consequences.
Right? Absolutely. A good example is simplifying voter registration.
Yeah.
It's a worthy goal, but we have to make sure any changes don't accidentally make the system more vulnerable to fraud.
Okay, so it's about finding that sweet spot between making voting accessible and keeping it secure.
Exactly. And recognizing that any change will probably have both positive and negative effects.
And I think the podcast also cautioned against complacency.
Yeah, we can't just rest on our laurels.
Right. Full voter participation isn't like checking a box and we're done.
It's a constant process of learning, adapting, and making things better.
I like that. A journey, not a destination.
Exactly. And as we continue on this journey,
Yeah.
democracy in action has equipped us with some valuable tools and insights.
It has, for sure.
It reminded us to understand the complexities, explore solutions, and take action both individually and collectively.
Couldn't have said it better myself, and that ending was really powerful.
Yeah, imagining a world where everyone votes.
It really makes you think, what would that world look like? How would things be different?
Would we see a shift in what politicians focus on? Would policies actually address the needs of everyday people?
It's incredible to think about.
It challenges us to dream big and envision a future where the true potential of democracy is unlocked.
And that journey towards that future starts with each of us.
Absolutely recognizing the power of our own voices, engaging in our communities, and striving to create a world where every single vote counts.
What an incredible conversation this deep dive into the barriers to voter engagement has been.
It really has.
We've explored the complexities, we've uncovered potential solutions, and hopefully sparked some inspiration for action.
Absolutely.
And as Democracy in Action reminded us so eloquently, the power to shape our democracy rests in each and every one of us. Thanks for joining us on this amazing journey.